Today we are going to be talking about the events that led to the war in Vietnam by the US. First, we have to think about the history of imperialism in Vietnam and all of the different countries that have had a say in their country. First was the Chinese influence. This started before the Common Era, and the Chinese brought Confucian beliefs and their hierarchy into Vietnamese culture, and they also brought Buddhism into the country. So most of the citizens became Buddhists, and they have been ever since. Now, the Vietnam finally fought for their independence in the 15th century and remained united and independent until the 19th century, which is the 1800s. But then the European countries like France and the United Kingdom started to look at imperialism throughout the globe. And one of the countries that they looked at was Vietnam, and they sent Catholic missionaries into Vietnam, and this converted 7 to 10% of the population from Buddhism or another religion into Catholicism. The Europeans also brought sharecropping, which is just people who have land, but they owe their money to the landlord who can make decisions, and this landlord was usually someone in France or other parts of Europe who had control over their Vietnamese's land and would exploit them and give them high taxes. Also, crops in Vietnam were exploited for the Western economy, like rice, and the French also brought rubber into Vietnam. It's a good climate to grow rubber trees. And then finally in 1890, France just created French Indochina and established 5 regions, including Vietnam and Laos and other countries. And that lasted all the way up until World War I. But then after World War I, many countries were seeking their own independence, and this included Vietnam. So now we'll talk about the fight for Vietnamese independence. This started with the rise of the Viet Minh, which is a communist group. They were created in a village called Pac Bo Plenum. During World War II, there was a famine in Vietnam that killed over 1 million Vietnamese, and the Viet Minh were there to help redistribute land and alleviate the famine more than anyone else did, including the French, who basically did nothing during World War II, partly because they were taken by the Germans and partly because they just did not want to. In 1945, there was a Japanese coup, and the Vietnamese gained no support from the French, and this proved once and for all to the Vietnamese that the French were not there to help them. And so on September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh and other Viet Minh leaders had a Declaration of Independence. Now what I want you to do is Google the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence and find some similarities between their Declaration of Independence and the United States' Declaration of Independence. And we will talk about why there are so many similarities in class. After the Vietnamese declared their independence and World War II was over, the French, who were greatly weakened in World War II, came back and they wanted to restore their power, especially in Vietnam, and retake it. Britain also did not want to support a Vietnamese independence, because if they supported a Vietnamese independence, they would have to lose all of their colonies around the world, and that is something that they were not interested in doing. The US was conflicted. They, on one side, wanted to keep their allies like France and Britain happy. They're our oldest allies, and we do a lot with them trade-wise and militarily-wise. They wanted protection, but they also the US was not a fan of colonialization, and they wanted to see it go away. The conflict between France and Vietnam began in September of 1945 and continued all the way until 1949. There were two fronts to the war, the hedgehog and the tiger. The hedgehog was France's tactic. They would keep the cities and roadways and try to win the war that way. And the Vietnamese took the tiger approach, which was keeping control of the jungles and villages, and would attack the towns and then retreat back into the jungle. After many battles, the French realized that they were not going to win this war if they continued any longer. So negotiations began in 1949 and ended with a semi-independent country, but all big decisions were still going to be made in France. The Geneva Conference was held in 1954 after the Korean War and after there was still some unrest in Vietnam because they still wanted a real independent nation. So the Geneva Conference, all great powers were assembled, and it ended in a partition between North and South Vietnam. There was also an election date set for July in 1956 in hopes to reunite the Communist North and the Democratic South and create one united, independent Vietnam. So we'll talk about North Vietnam first. In North Vietnam, there were land reforms to create agricultural cooperatives because it was a communist state, but most people wanted their own land, and some 15,000 people were murdered because of these land reforms, whether that be the police trying to enforce them or landowners killing each other for land. And in South Vietnam, President Diem was put in charge. He was a Catholic man, one of the minority of Vietnam. He was somewhat backed by the US because he was very westernized and easy to control by the United States. He was not very popular in Vietnam, however, and in some parts of the US by some officials, because he forced peasants to abandon their homes and moved them to fortified villages to try and contain the enemy and rebels who were trying to fight against the Democratic South and have the North take over. He also brought Catholics in from North Vietnam, refugees, but in doing this, he would kick out South Vietnamese peasants from their villages and give their land away. There's also the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and this was an attempt to have some sort of military in South Vietnam. They were given many U.S. weapons and financial assistance, but they were badly led, and they did not want to fight for a corrupt regime like South Vietnam and Diem. In 1956, when there was supposed to be an election, no one withheld the Geneva Accords and no election was held, continuing the North and South partition. And also, the people of South Vietnam had no sense of nationalism. There was no real South Vietnam, and the people did not want to fight and die for a corrupt government. The Americans have had involvement in Vietnam since World War II. They wanted to fight imperialism. They wanted to get the French colonialization out of there. However, they did not want a communist independent Vietnam that Ho Chi Minh wanted, because they were afraid that if Vietnam became communist, then all the surrounding countries would be communist, and communists would eventually spread all over. And that was bad because of their anti-communist belief and capitalist wants for the world. They tried to eliminate the communists in South Vietnam, and they were going to try and eventually defeat North Vietnam and make a united, democratic, independent Vietnam. But eventually they realized this was not going to work, so they went to war with Vietnam instead of just military intervention, which they had been doing. I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger, and you're going to look up the Gulf of Tonkin. We're going to talk about this in class next week, and I want you to bring in 2 facts from the Gulf of Tonkin. Why did it happen? And who was at fault? I'm going to leave you with that.